As some of you may know, one of my interests is psychology, and another one, no surprise, is Marxism. So on the odd moment that the two of them would intersect, this would be very interesting to me. You see, I came across an interesting claim against the Soviet Union that they had a fake diagnosis of schizophrenia in order to persecute political dissidents. And this does sound very strange why you would do that, because it would be completely unnecessary. So upon researching this allegation, I found there is a diagnosis that used to exist called sluggish schizophrenia. Now, according to Wikipedia and several other sources, this was allegedly a diagnosis of schizophrenia that had no symptoms, but those symptoms were expected to develop later on. And therefore, the person would be detained on mental health grounds because they disagreed with the government. Now, if this all sounds very dubious, a diagnosis of a mental illness with no symptoms, that's because it is. So I decided to track down the original source for this, and it led me to some very interesting places. This comes down to two claims. Did the Soviets invent a form of schizophrenia with no symptoms? And did they use it for political persecution purposes? As I said, this entire journey began with a Wikipedia article, and then eventually the process of going through all of its sources, and then the source of the sources to find the original claim where all of this came from. So get ready. On Wikipedia, it says sluggish schizophrenia or slow progressive schizophrenia was a diagnostic category used in the Soviet Union to describe what was claimed to be a form of schizophrenia characterized by a slow progressive course. It was diagnosed even in patients who showed no symptoms of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, on the assumption that these symptoms would appear later. The diagnosis has long been discredited because of its scientific inadequacy and its use as a means of confining dissidents. That last line, claiming that it was discredited and being used for political persecution purposes, now the source for this is a Canadian Medical Association journal from the 15th of October, 1988. The so-called source used by Wikipedia, it's literally just a guy making a claim with no evidence, data, or source whatsoever. The author, Harold Mirsky, provides absolutely no evidence of his claim. This claim that it was just abandoned because it had no scientific basis and that it was complete nonsense is, well, frankly, not true. Once the Soviet Union came to an end, they actually adopted the international standard of how to diagnose mental illnesses. They immediately wiped away everything that was Soviet, even in the government and everywhere else. So it's not a case of it was a lie and they now suddenly acknowledge it and then don't do it, even though, it's actually the same doctors that were there and mostly the same bureaucrats in those kind of psychiatry fields. They just switched the manual. And what we have for diagnosis of schizophrenia today and the categories of schizophrenia are better than what existed in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And what we have today is still better than what was in the rest of the world in the 1980s, because medicine, hopefully, progresses over time. So this idea that it was just universally discredited is actually a baseless claim. It was just that Soviets bad, therefore this diagnosis is bad. Like, it's a complete non sequitur that doesn't really make any sense. Wikipedia uses Adonicephora as a source saying there were no symptoms. Here's what he said in Can Psychiatry Be Misused Again? This notion allowed for the diagnosis of schizophrenia to be made even in the total absence of signs and symptoms of psychosis. Because of this reason, dissidents and political prisoners were confined in psychiatric hospitals where they were mistreated by being ordered unnecessary ECT without anesthesia, large doses of antipsychotic medications, and insulin comas. Of course, none of this actually really makes any sense, because if you're going to politically persecute someone, you could just throw them in jail. You wouldn't have to go through all of this. And believe it or not, doctors don't like intentionally being cruel to people. I mean, this is boogeyman level nonsense, which unsurprisingly doesn't have any solid evidence behind it whatsoever, other than claims made by people who were very obviously anti-Soviet. But it's important that his source points to somewhere else. If some of this sounds pretty ridiculous, that's because it is. None of this would have been actually necessary to carry out, because you could just throw someone in jail if they were a political dissident and charge them with a crime, which would have been infinitely easier to do and would have cost less resources and would have made less international attention. So this accusation, aside from the fact that it doesn't actually have anything to back it up, doesn't really make much sense. So after going through source after source after source about this alleged diagnosis having no symptoms, I eventually got to one source that actually cites the handbook used by the Soviet Union to diagnose mental illnesses in 1985. The problem is I was not able to actually find it anywhere. Like, I scoured as far as I could. I even had some academics go through as many journals and go through as many of their resources that they could and could not find anything. What I was able to find, however, was this specific diagnosis of schizophrenia being talked about and described by one of the men who wrote that very manual that I couldn't find. Sluggish schizophrenia is viewed not as an initial promotal stage of schizophrenia, but rather an independent diagnostic category characterized by a slow progressive course, subclinical manifestations in the latent period, overt psychopathological symptoms in the active period. So he's saying quite clearly that there are symptoms. That's how they know it's a form of schizophrenia. To actually make a long, complicated description simple, it was there are general manifestations, symptoms of schizophrenia. And then these would progressively get worse until they became specific symptoms that pointed to a particular kind of schizophrenia, which is why it was considered a different category itself. Now, what we have today in terms of diagnosing and categorizing mental illness is far better than what existed in the mid-'80s. And the Soviet Union would be no different in this case because, as I said, medicine progresses. There is absolutely no indication that the Soviets ever created some mental illness that had no symptoms whatsoever and then just used it to persecute people. So this illness that they claim was used simply does not exist. So we're going to have to move on to the next claim. On to the second criteria. What's the evidence for it being used on patients who showed no symptoms of schizophrenia for political persecution? After spending hours and hours researching the sources used by those who made the claim, not much was actually found at all. Wikipedia's sourceless claim is a book by Michael Robertson and Gary Walter called Ethics and Mental Health, the Patient, Profession, and Community. The book only discusses it happening to be one so-called political dissident, Vladimir Bukovsky, that has nothing to go by but his own word as someone working to overthrow the country. In other words, he presents no tangible evidence or even any evidence at all. Bukovsky was a major player in anti-Soviet activities and was frequently touted and funded by anti-Soviet countries and organizations. Now, for the claim that it was routine and done all the time to persecute people, they did cite another book as a source. Their source is the book No Asylum, State Psychiatric Repression by Thomas Olejnik. I apologize, I'm probably saying that wrong. In the book, he goes over how the evil Soviet Union was making claims that Robert Conquest would have been proud of. When it comes to the actual hard evidence of who was persecuted on mental health grounds, the multitude of papers and journals I looked over didn't name anyone in particular who was persecuted, except for this one. It had a list of so-called dissidents who were arrested and treated on mental health grounds as patients, and this one does. It compiled a list of people allegedly persecuted on those grounds. Here's the problem with the list. The source is the author himself, which he says he got from dissident publications. So from dissident groups and publications specifically designed to attack the Soviet Union. So they're not really credible at all, even if they had any tangible proof whatsoever. Well, here's another problem with his work. Olejnik wrote a book as a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, which later changed its name to the Association for Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies, dropping the reference to America on it. According to Wikipedia, the group was founded in 1948, and in the aftermath of World War II, the face of Europe was greatly changed. A number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe fell under the influence or control of the Soviet Union following the defeat of Germany. Throughout the non-communist world, political decision makers felt the need for additional academic analysis of the politics and history of the USSR and the Soviet bloc nations, as well as for improved facilities for language training for a new generation of foreign affairs specialists. So the source of all these allegations is a guy who worked for an anti-Soviet think tank propped up by the government specifically to language train and history train people who were going to work for the US government with regards to the Soviet Union. So given that, you can probably forgive me for being extremely skeptical of what he claims in the book. There is, however, some evidence of at least one person possibly being persecuted this way. A dissident, Henry Artyunov, claims he was falsely labeled as mentally ill. To his credit, he provides documentation to support this. Now, I cannot confirm that this documentation is real, but it does appear to be so. The problem with this documentation, which is linked, by the way, is that they're just internal documents that say he was stopped for mental health grounds and had a examination, that he went to school here, he learned this, and that he frequently wrote letters to the Central Committee criticizing policy. You see, the thing is, there's really nothing there which indicates that anything happened other than he received an evaluation that said there were some abnormalities. So his document doesn't actually show that he was falsely accused of anything. It just says there was an evaluation there. And like, really, why would the government even waste all that time to persecute someone who just sent letters to the government? That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. This doesn't even really fit under the category of dissident. Writing letters to the government criticizing policy doesn't actually constitute being a political dissident. That's not what a dissident is. So this whole claim that he was given, a false mental health diagnosis doesn't really make any sense. I think he legitimately got arrested for doing something, got an evaluation and found out, yeah, there's something mildly wrong with him. And then this becomes his idea that he was being politically persecuted. Now, the documents, they're not KGB per se. Like, these aren't KGB analysis and whatnot, like he claims on the website. These are just internal documents from the KGB saying, this guy got arrested, he got this evaluation, etc. The KGB wasn't actually involved like he claims. This was just the KGB records of what happened, and then completely connects them to the Federal Security Bureau of Russia today for some reason, which I don't know why you would do that, because it doesn't really make any sense. Given all this, the false accusation of the illness and the failure to show any systemic persecution using it, I'm going to have to call this false Cold War propaganda. Now, this is not to say that political persecution did not happen in the Soviet Union. Of course it did, because it happens in every country. There was absolutely no country in the world that has ever existed or exists today that is not engaged in political persecution. This is an idea that some people find difficult to understand. Systems, all of them, have defense mechanisms built into them to defend themselves from being destroyed. When you have a significant effort by a superpower, the United States, literally trying to overthrow your country for its own benefit, you are going to have defensive measures put in. Just like there were defensive measures in the United States to go ahead and defend itself from any of the multitude of communist organizations that were calling for it to be overthrown. That's what systems do. They defend themselves from being attacked. There's nothing out of the ordinary here. Now, you can argue on human rights grounds that this shouldn't happen, or that the people should have been treated better, etc. But to complain that there was a defense mechanism when everybody has a defense mechanism because it's inherent to systems themselves is kind of nonsense and completely hypocritical. So I'm sure maybe there was somewhere somebody made a false diagnosis to persecute somebody, because these kinds of things happen everywhere. The Soviet Union would not be unique in this in any way. It happens in the United States. It happens in Canada. It happens in Australia, the UK, Japan, etc. This happens everywhere. The question here was there a diagnosis of a schizophrenia that had no symptoms? That's false. Was that diagnosis that we now know doesn't exist used to politically persecute people on a large scale? No. There's not any tangible evidence of it whatsoever. Although I wouldn't be surprised if maybe a couple of people did experience that, because there is some level of corruption in every system. So I'm going to have to go ahead and call this a lie based on those two criteria. And in fact, Soviet psychiatry actually was ahead of Western psychiatry in a few areas. Like, they had abolished psychosurgery, which is a lobotomy. That's the actual term for it. They abolished it decades before the United States did. And in fact, the United States still does them to this day, where they go in and remove a piece of your brain because you're hard to deal with. So essentially, to control you, they remove a part of your brain to make you almost comatose. So you can question the morality on that. So I'm going to have to go ahead and call this allegation of abusive psychiatry on a mass scale and this particular diagnosis nonsense, because there's no evidence whatsoever for this diagnosis, and there's no significant evidence anywhere that it was used to persecute people en masse. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.